Hello and welcome, everybody. I am super excited to be here with you today to start our gluten-free sourdough journey. And the first thing that we need to do is start a starter. So today we're going to make that first step together, and then I'll be with you for the next 2-3 weeks until we all have a really good, viable starter. And then we're going to test our starter. And usually I like to use a pancake recipe for that. And then at the end, we get to bake bread together. What I found with this really ancient form of baking, it's been around for, at least as we know, for more than 5,500 years. So this goes back way before we had regular traditional yeast baking or baking powder and baking soda. That way of baking with sourdough is you're using natural bacteria and yeast that are beneficial for our gut to leaven bread, or leaven anything, to create that rise, that airiness, that fluffiness. So when we look at sourdough, as I said before, it harvests the bacteria and the yeast that's in the air, that's on the grain, that may even be on your hand, even though I'm always saying wash your hands before. But it's really fascinating because a sourdough is a microcosm of a lot of different bacteria and yeasts. So this one is a brown rice flour. Her name is Hildegard. I named them all because they all have different personalities, different characteristics. Hildegard is very gentle. She is powerful and very, very versatile. So I love that you can bake bread with her. You can make cakes, cookies, pancakes, scones. So this one is, I think, 9 months old at this point. So it's definitely mature. And you can see when I feed it. So this, I fed her at night, last night. She doubled and then she collapsed, which is something very natural. And later on in the process, you will see that. But in the beginning, it's going to look very differently. So this is just a quick overview of what's to come to create that starter, and then going into testing it with a recipe like pancakes, and then baking bread together. So what I found is that this process is truly almost a sacred ritual, because we have had that for generations. It has been a way of creating bread that nourishes us. And there have been women, mostly women, before us, at least at our grandmother's time and further back, that have been able to create nourishment. And while it was hard labor at the time, it's not that hard anymore, it also allowed them to bring out their creativity, bring out their female aspect of nourishing and caring for people. And it was calming to the nervous system. So when we stir and chop and knead, those rocking rhythmic movements have been shown to calm our nervous system. And in a time where everything has to be super fast, where we run to the store to pick up some bread that is full of additives and preservatives and all of that, maybe we get cut off on the way there. There is nothing that allows us to nourish ourselves or to calm ourselves. And I love that practice of sourdough baking because it gives us something that I feel we got stripped of. So with all my baking sessions, I find you have to be present and mindful. And I like to start with a meditation. So to get grounded in, to be really present in a moment, I always kick off my shoes and I am totally in contact with Mother Earth. So if you can, I'm going to invite you to stand up, kick off your shoes, close your eyes, shake your body, relax, and let's do a little bit of a grounding meditation. So take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Maybe you can feel your shoulders sink. Mine seem to be glued to my ears these days a lot, so let them drop. Take another deep breath in and out through your mouth. And this time, take one hand, put it on your heart, on your chest, one on your soft belly. And as you take your third breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, you may feel that somehow just the ability to touch your body, you've kind of closed a circuit. Kind of feel held, safe, and relaxed. So be there for a moment. If you can't stand, do it while you sit. Just put your one hand on your chest, on your heart, and one on your soft belly, and check in with yourself. Use your breath to further relax. And if it's hard to do that, scan your body. Start from your forehead. Let go of the folds, the fine lines. Relax that forehead. Wander down in your mind to your nose and to your mouth. Let your jaw gently fall. Mindful of your neck. If it feels tight, you may want to move it a little bit, get looser. Take those shoulders and bring them even closer together, drop them down. Feel your energy moving down your arms, let them relax. Just gently holding your abdomen, your chest. Traveling down your spine. Loosen it up. Maybe you need a little bit of movement. Your hips, if you can. Shake and wiggle them a little bit, rotate them. Just really feel into your body. Get loose and present. We're traveling down our legs, into our calves, ankles, and feet, and toes. Just be mindful, be present. Let your mind wander to all the parts of your body. I'm going to invite you on a little journey now. Asking to be as present as you are in your body, to take that journey with your body. Going down a corridor, you can smell something sweet and delicious. That smell that comes out of a kitchen. It may be recent, or it could be a memory of when you were a child, or even a scene in your mind from years gone by, from a long time ago. Get to the door, the kitchen, you poke your head in. There's a lot of activity going on. You see somebody kneading dough. You see all sorts of jars and flour. It is warm. You see the activity. Somebody's taking out bread from the oven. And you know it's way too hot to cut. But you would love nothing more than a slice right now. Bread and baking bread has been nourishment for so long. Just thinking of it makes your mouth salivate. And you're fascinated by that process to maybe one day be part of this activity in the kitchen. The magic in those bowls, the alchemy that happens when you mix flour, water, and salt. You know that later in the day you get to share in that bread that was made with love, with clean ingredients. You know that it will nourish you, your family, and will be able to absorb all the goodness that's in that loaf. You know deep down that this is something that you can do, that excites you to do, and you can't wait to one day be part of that group of beautiful humans that came before us. Right now, you're just watching the activities, and you know you need to go back to your task. You're ready to one day step in and take your place in a long line of bakers that came before you. I'm going to ask you to come back to your body. To keep your shoulders dropped and yourself present in the moment. Move a little bit if you can. Drop your hands and your shoulders. Take a deep breath in and out. And then open your eyes and let the journey begin. All right. So I think we all have a line somewhere to people that came before us. I know for me, my parents, my father, my mother, they baked, but they never baked bread. But I found out that my grandmother and her mother, they used to bake all their bread, all their sourdough bread together. It was regular wheat at that time, but they would bake in community in the town hearth once a month, huge loaves of bread that would be enough for the whole month to sustain the family. And then there was again a one day a month where they heated up this ginormous stone oven where they all came together to bake. And I still have memories of visiting my grandmother, of enjoying that bread, and of the town hearth. At that point, she had already started baking at home, but it was so fascinating to me to see what she's putting together. So when we think about all this tradition that is in our genes, that's in our lines, and now so many have come to the point, and you are probably too, if you're here, to look at, bread and being something that we can't digest, that it's not good for us, and all that marketing that we've heard. There is a way to still have your cake and eat it too, have your bread and eat it too. And it starts with the flours that we are using. The process is actually very simple when you know the tricks, how it is different from regular wheat baking. All the flours that I'm using are certified gluten-free. And I like to select whole wheat flour, not whole wheat, whole grain flour. Because when we go through this process, we want it to be good for us too, not just taste good. And the more whole the flour is, the better the fermentation takes place. So let's talk a little bit about the flour quickly. I've asked you to get, for this sourdough starter, the Anthony's premium brown rice flour. Brown rice is the easiest flour to use to create a starter, especially if you have never done it before. And there are a lot of other flours on the market. The reason why I recommend Anthony's or Authentic Foods, those two brands are currently the only two on the market that mill their flour super fine. So it feels really fine and silky like we are used to regular flour. All the other brands, unfortunately, are a lot coarser, and they create this gritty texture that I think that gave gluten-free baked goods sort of a bad rap. You will not have that consistency in your bread with that flour. Plus, all the recipes are designed around it. Now, I have absolutely no affiliation. If there were other brands that worked, I would just equally as well recommend them. But unfortunately, right now, we only have those two brands. And the other one is more expensive, but they work the same. So why not go with Anthony's? I trust them. Then later on, you will see that I use a lot of millet and sorghum in my recipes. Millet is an alkaline grain that helps keep our body in an alkaline state, which means it's a healing, a healthy state. Disease is created in an acidic environment. So some grains tend to be a little bit more acid forming. Millet is really nice that way. It's easy to digest. It's sort of a medium light grain. It has kind of a little bit of a nutty flavor. It has a lot of minerals, trace minerals like magnesium, iron, things like that, that is good for us, that we are missing a lot in our diet. And it's really high in B vitamins, which as women, we really need for our metabolism, for hormones. I mean, anybody, but especially for women, it's really great. So that is one of the flours that I love a lot and sometimes recommend to later down the road, maybe even start a second starter with millet, but it's a little bit more limited. The other one that I love is sorghum. Sorghum and millet in Ayurvedic medicine are kind of like twins, because they bring out the best in each other. So when you combine the two, you are amplifying the goodness in each of the flours. It's also an ancient grain. It's a little bit more sweet than millet is. It's kind of the same consistency. It is very high in protein for grains, and it brings calcium and potassium and all those minerals to the table. Also iron. So I like to work with both of them together. Now, I have not found one from Anthony's, but I like to use Arrowhead Mills, is very good for millet, or what do you here? Sorghum, that is also an organic, raw, certified sorghum flour. So they work really well. And then most of the others that I use are the Anthony's ones. You will see that in some of the documents that I will send out, what are my preferred flours. At the end, you can use whichever one you want, just don't deviate much from the rice flour. Especially don't go, I hate to say that, with Bob's Red Mill. It's very gritty, it doesn't absorb, it will throw off everything. And so I would recommend stay away from that. So when we look at a starter or baking with it, so when we have wheat, when we have gluten is kind of like the glue. It creates this network that allows us to get big air bubbles in bread, that makes it chewy. It's all the things that we like about bread. But when we do gluten-free baking, we are removing all of this. So now we have to come up with combinations of flour to kind of recreate what we took out without adding gluten in. When you work with the whole grains that I like to work, or in general with gluten-free baking, the items tend to be denser. And when we are used to fluffy bread and fluffy cakes, we are using starches. I like to stay with healthy starches. I mean, in quotes because it is starch, but it will help us create a finer crumb. Potato starch, for example, brings moisture into it, because when you take that gluten structure out, there's nothing that traps moisture or traps air. So you have to compensate for that. Tapioca is a starch that's very often used in bread baking that gives it a crispness, kind of like a beautiful sheen. It's a little bit of a binder. So you're using things to simulate what we are used to that we can't have. So I have recipes that are very low or no starch. They are more of a health bread. For this journey, we are going with a traditional, simple beginner boule that resembles like your traditional sourdough bread. So we'll have a little bit of the mixture. That comes at the next live where we bake bread together, but I wanted you to think about what we are doing and why we're doing this. So with this said, let's dive into starter making. You have a handout that walks you through all the steps of creating a starter. Online, you find a lot of, as I mentioned, processes that just copy what's typically done with wheat flour, but gluten-free flour has a different ability to absorb moisture, and because we don't have the gluten structure, the bubbling is different. So they're a little bit more fragile, if I want to say. So when you go through creating the process of having a starter, what you're doing is you're adding moisture, water, in this case, filtered water. We can't have any like chlorine or something like that in it because that kind of kills off microbes, and we are trying to harvest microbes. So filtered water, I use reverse osmosis water, but any like bottled water that does not have chlorine is appropriate. When you mix water and flour, you're giving the bacteria that are naturally on the outside of the grain, they're in the flour or in the air, the ability to multiply, which is a good thing, but it's also not so good because right now in the beginning stages, in the first phase, you have no control over the microbes that are in there. I call that phase the battle of good and bad, because you have good bacteria, good yeast, and not so good yeast. As the days go on, you will see, and each starter is different because your batch of flour is different, your kitchen environment is different. So your starter will look very differently or behave slightly differently than mine will. But the process stays the same. So the first several days, you will probably see a lot of activity. It can smell kind of off. It can smell like yeast. It can be super active. That is, as I said, the battle of good and bad. You are having the good bacteria that we want, but we also have the bad ones that we can't ingest that would make us sick. So often I see when somebody starts creating a starter and they have really active activity to think, oh, my starter is ready, I can bake. This early in the stage, you absolutely cannot use it to bake. After that, so this phase can last anywhere between 2 days to 6 days. But at some point, the activity dies down. And that is the phase that I call rest and rejuvenation. So when you have fermentation going on, we keep feeding all the bacteria. But what's so magical to me is eventually the pH starts dropping. It becomes sour. And the further the pH drops, the more of the bad bacteria die off and the good ones survive. And to me, that's just blows my mind every time I think about that, how ingenious it is. So all the bad guys have died down, but the good ones are resting. So there may be a day, 2 days, 5 days. It all depends on your starter. There will be a period where there's nothing happening. And that is usually when people say, I think I killed my starter. It's not dead. It's resting. It's sleeping. It's getting ready. As long as you don't see fuzz, which is mold, or you see color streaks like pink or orange or red or purple, you're fine. If there's color, we got in microbes that are not good for us. We have to start over. And when you have mold, obviously we don't want to ingest mold. But as long as those don't show up, stay with it. Stay with it and keep feeding it. And we'll go through the steps of what they look like in a second. But at some point, they wake up. And that is the phase of awakening, where it's that intersection of rest and rejuvenation and awakening is the most fragile one. When we get through this, you'll see in my process that we create kind of like a backup safety thing where we take portions, put them in the refrigerator overnight until we feed again, until we can make sure it's still with us, we're still doing well. And then at some point, 3 to 5 days after we have then our second phase of fermentation, of activation, that's when we can start testing it. And we're testing it, as I said, very often I like to use a pancake recipe, because if the pH is low enough, around 4.5, we can create, for example, pancakes with baking soda and baking powder, and they will taste delicious versus metallic, and we know the pH is low enough. And then we can think about building it up for another couple days before we start baking bread. So it is a process, and at any point, things can go a little haywire. So I like to be really, really careful about keeping our utensils clean. Porcelain or glass bowls work well. In the beginning, I like to use a little bit of a larger glass vessel. Eventually, this one is, in my opinion, the ideal size. It's a 16-ounce just mason jar, wide mouth, because you can get in and out very easily. You can keep it clean using either plastic or high-grade stainless steel. And always in between, I like to rinse it out with hot water. I use regular tap water, but then I also heat up some water in my tea kettle and just swish it out with boiling hot water just to keep it somewhat sterile. We don't have to go into real detail like we would sterilize a mason jar for jam making. It is just so it's clean enough for the next 24 hours until we feed again. So after that phase, then, as I said, when we test it, then a couple days later, we should be good for making our first bread. Your starter gets more and more active and strong and flavorful as it ages. I have a starter in my refrigerator. His name is Hugo. He's over 2 years old. He's very robust. You feed Hugo in 2-3 hours, he's ready to bake. It's a millet starter. It's just very boisterous. It's there with great flavor. Agnes or Hildegard, they are brown rice starters, brown rice flour starters. They're a little bit more gentle. They take a little bit more time. So as you go through this journey, I really encourage you, have a notebook and document, as if you are in chemistry lesson way back when in school. Document what you see, what they smell, how they behave. Because later on, when we get into bread baking especially, we are playing with a lot of different variables, and your bread, your dough, and your starter will respond based on the temperature. The warmer it is, the faster they react. If it's too warm, then we may introduce mold. So there's this ideal range of 68 to 75, 76, 78, maybe even in the summer, that work really well. So the warmer it is, the faster it reacts. And the more active your starter is, the faster it will rise. So if you have a starter after if it's mature, let's say it's 2-3 weeks old, you're not baking every day. You can refrigerate it in between, but when you take it out of the refrigerator, you need to give it time to reactivate. The refrigerator is kind of like, it slows the process way down. It sort of puts the the starter in a kind of like semi-hibernation. So when you take it out, then you want to give it an extra feeding just to wake it up before it's really ready to bake. But we'll get to that when we reach that point. But you're playing with temperature and activity of your starter that determine the rise time of your bread down the road. So it may all sound a little bit overwhelming right now, but I promise you, as we go down that path, it will become nearly second nature. And you know, if it is winter and your starter in the summer needs 4 hours to rise your bread, it may in the winter need 5 or 6 hours. Or we can play with it and take the dough and put it in the refrigerator overnight. It'll give you a different crumb. It allows you more time, but then you know that it will not be overproofed. So temperature is very much a variable that we like to play with to get different results. So with all that said, we'll start the first 3 days to keep a larger amount of flour. The reason being is, and if you have printed out your handout, up until day 3, we are keeping everything in one jar. We don't want to add anything, any additional bacteria. We just feed what's in it. Then at day 3, we start taking starter out, put it in our bowl to measure, and then clean this jar and put it back in. At day 6, we are further reducing it because otherwise you go through a lot of flour unnecessarily. By day 6, it should be safe enough to go down to the final amount, which is you keep 50 grams of starter, you feed it with 50 grams of flour. And then in gluten-free baking, I found if you take 20% more water than flour or starter, the extra liquid that eventually becomes hooch once it's in phase 3 protects the surface. So you're less likely to get mold, you're less likely to get bacteria. So that is something that I found works really well, and all of my recipes account for the additional water or hydration, the higher hydration that we are using. When you are in that middle phase and then the rest of rejuvenation, the way it's laid out in the document are the ideal steps. When you find that your starter is slower, there's nothing wrong with it. I've had starters that took 2 weeks before they finally got into the awakening. It is just so individual. So don't give up. Keep feeding it. Just keep staying at the same day until you see that it's coming out. If you find that you're on the brink, you can start reducing. But if not, just keep feeding it until we get out of that critical moment. And you're always welcome to check in. Actually, this is part of it. Check in, stay in communication, what your starter is doing. And then when you go into the awakening phase, that's when the fun begins, because you know you've made it through that long runway, and now we're talking sourdough. Now the liquid is hooch, it's fermented, it's not the separation of water and flour in the first couple days, and we're off to a good start. Trying to think if I forgot to mention anything else. And if you're lucky, that whole process can be done in 7 days. And I have had situations where I created a starter and it goes from the battle of good and bad through the activation so quick that it was an afternoon where it just stopped, and then overnight went into the awakening phase. So if there's nothing really noticeable that rest period, don't panic. You will know the difference because you're going from a pasty water and flour mixture to a mousse-like silky mixture. And it will smell sour, it will be pleasant, and it just looks different. So a lot of, when we talk about baking or sourdough baking, I like to say, you need to learn the feel for it. And that's what my grandmother almost said to me. And I hated it as a child, because like, what do you mean? You're making apple strudel and you say, take a little bit of that, take a little bit of that. and feel the dough. And I'm like, Oma, can't you just tell me how much? She says, no, you need to feel the dough. And now, as an adult, being on this journey, I know why she said that. Because each day, each time, it's slightly different. And you will learn with time what your starter looks like, what your dough looks like, what your bread looks like. So everything becomes a guideline, but you have full permission to be in that communication with your dough to know if it needs a little bit more rise time, a little less, maybe a little bit more water. And when I say little, that could be as little as 10 grams or 5 grams. But you have that permission, and I encourage you to make those changes. In the beginning, I'm only asking you to follow the recipes so you learn what to look for. I think that makes sense. Because my kitchen is going to be different. I mean, right now we have 72 degrees. It's really warm here. Your house may be 68. Your starter is going to be slower than mine. All right. So with all this introduction, with all this information, I encourage you to take a look at the document. You will have day-by-day videos and pictures, and you will have the chance to check in with me, share with me where your starter is, send me pictures, ask me questions, so that you really you're supported all through that process until we finally make the bread and after. And with that said, let's get started and actually make a starter. So everything we do is by weight measure. And if you're not used to it, I really encourage you, get yourself a digital scale if you don't have one, and measure in grams. That is sort of the standard in baking, to use metric, and it's a lot more precise than when you measure in cups. We'll see that even 5 grams more or less makes a difference in the final product. And it's really hard to measure when you measure in cups to that precision. So it's very easy to take a cup of flour and it could be 10 grams more or 10 grams less, which you will finally see that in the final bread or dough. And since we're already measuring, we're measuring the weight of the liquids as well. So we'll measure the water, we'll measure the oil, whatever else liquid that we add. It's all in grams. So let's start here. I'm gonna show you what I'm doing. So usually when we feed down the line, I would use a bowl. But for the beginning, I'm going to just use my larger glass jar. And we are starting with a little extra flour, as I said. That's 100 grams. So it's zeroed out. And I add to this jar 100 grams of brown rice flour. Almost there. All right. So 100 grams. And then we'll just add, as I said, 20% more water than flour. So this is 120 grams of water. So now we have a total of 220 grams of flour water mixture. We'll stir it up. I really want to make sure that you're really well stirred and you don't have pockets of flour sitting on the bottom. Push it down so I can see where the limit is, or the level. I flatten it out. It's really pasty here. I'm going to show you. Here we go. I don't know if you can see it, but it's like a real thick paste. That's what you're going for. So we'll smooth out the top. Try to keep as little or as much off the side as possible. And then we're going to mark this with a rubber band. This is going to be our gauge to see what activity we have. So if we are lucky, we may see some bubbles later today or by tomorrow. So for today and tomorrow, you're not taking anything out of here. We'll cover it with a cotton cloth. This is just a cotton napkin, because we want the air to go through, any gases to evaporate. So we're not using like a plastic wrap like we can use later on. We want that air circulation. So we'll cover it up. And then my counters are cold. I use a cork trivet and just put it on the cork trivet. So this is our new starter. That's all that it takes to get us started. And one that, as I said, is about 9 months old. And then tomorrow, you're taking this, stir it up, add the 50 grams of flour, the 60 grams of water, move your rubber band, cover it up, just keep an eye on it, keep it warm, and see how it's doing. And that is really all. So it's the tricky part is not the starting of the starter, even though for many people that's the most intimidating part. That's the easy part. What gets overwhelming is to see how it develops and what you need to do going forward. So you have all of this in there. I will check in with you via email every day as to what your starter might look like. And then with any questions, reach out, share some pictures, and hopefully within a week, we will have some great sourdough fermentations and bubbles going on, and we can think about testing and making bread. So thank you so much for today, and I can't wait to see what's bubbling in your kitchen.